Let's talk about moral ambiguity in a black and white universe, which is the fourth essay included in the 2005 publication Star Wars and Philosophy. Now, since each chapter in this book is a separate essay written by a different author, let's take a minute and look into who wrote this particular chapter before we jump into it. So, this essay was written by Dr. Richard Dees. Not sure if that should be pronounced Dees or Dees. He received his PhD from the University of Michigan in 1990. According to his personal website, he is professor of philosophy at the University of Rochester with research and teaching interests in public health ethics, neuroethics, and political philosophy. He says, in addition to my primary appointment in philosophy, I also serve as the chair of the steering committee for the public health-related majors. Then he says, within this program, I direct the bioethics major. And then he says, I also work with the clinical ethics program in the Department of Health, Humanities, and Bioethics at the University of Rochester Medical School. Then over on his CV, he lists his areas of specialization as being public health ethics, medical ethics, and social and political philosophy. And he lists his areas of competence as ethics and the history of moral and political philosophy. He also published a book in 2004 called Trust and Toleration, which, according to Amazon.com, it's a book which argues that maintaining trust is the key to stable practices of toleration. So that's Richard Dees, definitely someone who has spent a lot of time thinking about ethics and philosophy. So now let's take a look at what he has to say about the classic Star Wars films in regard to, as he put it in the title there, moral ambiguity in a black and white universe. So he starts off by noting the image of Vader in black next to Leia in white, and how this is kind of like Star Wars as a whole. Every character is either on the light side or on the dark side. But he adds that there's also some intriguing moral ambiguity in the stories. First, there are some characters that seem ambiguous until we come to understand them later on. And then secondly, there are also characters like Dooku and Anakin that are a little closer to real-life ambiguity. And so the rest of this essay is going to be an expansion of those 2 points. So for that first part, those who seem ambiguous until we get to understand them better, he's going to be talking about Han Solo, Jango Fett, and Lando Calrissian as examples of ethical egoism, both self-serving egoism and enlightened egoism, and then of utilitarianism. And then for that second part, he's going to discuss Count Dooku as almost an example of true ambiguity, followed by Anakin Skywalker as almost an example of true ambiguity, followed by Darth Vader as an actual example of true ambiguity as he sees it. And then after that, there will be a summary and conclusion of the essay, and then that's everything. So the essay ends up having 5 main points, you could say. It's got the ethical egoism section with Han Solo and Jango Fett. It's got the utilitarianism section with Lando Calrissian. It's got the almost true ambiguity with Dooku, almost true ambiguity with Anakin, and then true ambiguity with Vader, and then the summary and conclusion. So I guess you'd say with the conclusion, there's 6, I suppose. So his first section is his discussion of ethical egoism. He brings up Han Solo and gives us an intro to that character with a reminder of the key story points for the character there. And he identifies Han's approach to ethics as self-serving egoism. And then he brings up the character of Jango Fett as another example of self-serving egoism. He explains, Han and Jango's view is a form of ethical egoism, the view that morally what I should do is what is in my interest to do. End quote. And then he gives a Thomas Hobbes quote. He talks about the nature of self-interest, and then that whole paragraph there's just got a bunch of really good quotes in it. But then after that, he brings up enlightened egoism, a version that makes room for the consideration of other people and of society for pragmatic reasons, and which ends up looking a lot more like normal morality. So he explains, Han, unlike Jango, shows the necessary dispositions for this better form of egoism. And he adds, more importantly, he shows a capacity for something more. So he cites some early signs in the films of the existence of Han's hidden conscience and Han's desire to do good within the stories there. One of the things he says along this line that I jotted down was, unlike the narrowly egoistic Jango, Han is capable of true and deep friendships. He is willing to risk all for both Luke and Leia. So at that point, Han is kind of an enlightened egoist who has some limits on how low he would go, but Dees explains that eventually, quote, his love for Luke and Leia eventually leads him to commit himself to a greater good and to express a moral regard for oppressed people everywhere. He explains, by committing himself to a genuinely moral cause, he escapes his egoism. Or perhaps he does not so much escape his egoism as much as his self-interest becomes so broad that it encompasses all of morality. All right, so having discussed ethical egoism, he then goes on to discuss utilitarianism through the character of Lando Calrissian. He talks about Lando's dilemma back in episode 5. Should he betray Han to Vader, or should he refuse to do so and then the Empire takes over all of Bespin? So Dees points out that it might look egoistic at first, but once we realize that his decision is actually done for the sake of others, for the sake of the interests of others, then we start to realize this is actually a pretty good example of a utilitarian moral decision. So Dees gives a definition of utilitarianism from John Stuart Mill, and then he goes into detail about how Lando's actions make sense from a utilitarian standpoint, and how from that viewpoint, Lando is actually not a moral coward in the story, but actually a character who took an act of difficult moral courage. And then he points out how later on in the story, Lando's other actions go on to reveal and to really underscore the visible strength of his values and his courage and his moral character. So then, having discussed utilitarianism, he goes on to suggest possible examples of ambiguity. And he starts with Count Dooku and the events from Episode 3, where Dooku warns Obi-Wan that the Republic has been infiltrated, and he tries to convince Obi-Wan to join him in helping to undermine the Republic. So Dees explains there, he says, "Here's an interestingly ambiguous scenario. We have two characters, each of whom is acting on what he thinks is best for everyone. We know Obi-Wan better, so we're more likely to trust his judgment, but we also know that the information provided by Dooku is accurate." So he goes on to explain how Obi-Wan fails to see the greater danger due to his trust in the Jedi Council. And he says then, "The dispute is a conflict of visions, based partially on a conflict in knowledge. In such scenarios lie great moral tragedies." So that's where the ambiguity would be, but he explains that the reason this is only almost ambiguity is because, as the audience, we already know that Dooku has the worst of intentions. He's been lying from the beginning, and he's actually a Sith himself. So Dees says in the end there, Dooku, as it turns out, is not morally ambiguous at all. He's simply a subtle instrument of evil. The movie thus misses the opportunity to teach an important moral lesson. Sincere people can honestly disagree about the correct moral course. End quote. So that was almost ambiguity number 1. Then he goes on to almost ambiguity number 2. He says, on the face of it, the most morally ambiguous character in the Star Wars saga must be Anakin Skywalker. But I think that Anakin is not in fact so ambiguous. So he walks us through the story of the character and points out how, in his opinion, back in Episode 1, Anakin is nothing but innocence and goodness. But from the very beginning of Episode 2, there's nothing virtuous at all that you can see in the character as he sees it. He goes on to talk about the roles of emotions and impulsivity and reflection in morality. And he says, the problem is not that Anakin acts on his emotions. If we willfully ignore what reason tells us, we become controlled by every whim of our emotions, and we lose our capacity to make moral decisions. Anakin's recklessness is then a vice. End quote. So Anakin's impulsivity and his recklessness and his lack of appropriate reflection, all these things end up leading toward Anakin's fall, to that sequence with the killing of the Sand People and everything else that goes on there. So Dees goes on to talk about the role that love plays in the stories, and he goes back to the Han character arc, where love was what ended up redeeming Han, basically. But Dees points out that exclusive love for only those close to us, such as what led to Anakin's fall, that can be morally selfish and can blind us to the anguish of others. So, he explains, Anakin's love makes his anger understandable, but what he does with that anger is no less horrible because love lies behind it. He points out, only our and Padme's sympathy for Anakin as a character prevents us from seeing that he is already an agent of evil. End quote. So Dees suggests that Anakin is actually not ambiguous at all, but Darth Vader, by contrast, who Anakin turns into and who we see mostly starting in Episode 4, he actually is, quote, more ambiguous than we might think. After all, he says, Vader seeks peace and order for the galaxy. And then secondly, he points out how Luke does, quote, feel the good in him. Now, in the end, Vader's going to end up killing the Emperor to save Luke, but he points out, his motivations in killing the Emperor are not that different from his earlier motivations in killing the Sand People. He acts out of love for a member of his family. But of course, the big difference there is that this time he is killing only the guilty and he's acting to save the innocent. So the action is quite morally different, but the motivation is remarkably similar. Dees explains, so oddly, at the end of Return of the Jedi, Anakin finally does become a morally ambiguous figure. He does great good, even if the motivations are not entirely good, and even if they do not begin to atone for the great evils he has done in his life. End quote. So, having talked about Vader as the example of true ambiguity, Dees then draws us back to that full lineup of Han, Dooku, Anakin, Vader, and Lando. And then he says, as he kind of begins to wrap things up, he says, most moral decisions we make in our lives are relatively easy and so ordinary that we hardly think of them as moral decisions at all. But we may still be ill-prepared to think about the difficult moral decisions which may confront us and which could prove to be the crucible of our moral characters. In thinking about the moral ambiguity of the seemingly black and white universe of Star Wars, we can see how morally complex a simple world can be, and we can begin to prepare for the moral complexities of our own less than simple world. End quote. And that's the final sentence of the chapter. Pretty cool way to finish out the chapter as far as I'm concerned. So, I don't know, I think that Richard Dees did a pretty impressive job putting together a concise introductory essay on moral ambiguity and complexity in the classic Star Wars films for this book back in 2005. And I think his final comments there at the very end about the importance of being prepared for moral complexities, I think that's just a really good reminder for all of us of how fiction and imagination and things like that can give us really a much needed opportunity to prepare to live the best we can in our real lives. All right, so this wraps up my short series of videos here. I might make one or two more videos as I keep going through the rest of the book in my own time. I might make one or two more videos if there are little tidbits that stand out that I think might make a good video here and there. But for now, it's been fun thinking about their take on, as they put it, the philosophical messages of Star Wars for these 4 chapters here in that section, in the first part of that Star Wars and Philosophy, that first Star Wars and Philosophy book from back in 2005. Anyway, so that's it for this video. If you enjoyed this video, and if you want to see more videos where we think together about some aspect of where sci-fi and fantasy meet with things like psychology, philosophy, and spirituality, then make sure you go ahead and hit that subscribe button. But see you in the next one.